God, we are grateful to come together again to learn more of your word and more of your story that we are drawn into. Pray that your spirit is with us tonight, that you illuminate scriptures to us, and that you guide us into living out your word. Pray all this in Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you. And Brooks said just the perfect thing, that this is God's story. And that's one thing I hope everybody gets from as we move through scripture, that the central character is God. And it is the story of what God is doing in creation, which is a pretty remarkable statement, that there is even a creation that God, in God's love, chose to poof and make it exist, right? Last week, we saw the creation, and we saw two stories of creation. And do you remember one of the stories, Genesis chapter 1? What was kind of your impression of who God is in that story? What kind of character is God in Genesis chapter 1?
He was kind of a deity more than someone that you could communicate with.
Yes, high and mighty. You can really kind of connect this to Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah says, I was in the temple in the year that King Uzziah died, and I saw the Lord on his throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. This sort of regal, lofty, high, mighty deity. What's your sense of God in the second chapter and third chapter of Genesis? What kind of character is God?
Like a daddy.
Yeah, and not a father.
Right, a daddy.
Daddy, yeah. Or one might even just say a companion, right? He's approachable. He's still in charge, right? He made the garden. It is his garden. Adam is his gardener. But he's very approachable. We threw out the question, who would you rather have supper with? God as you meet him in the first chapter of Genesis, or as in you meet him in the second and third chapters? Who would you rather?
Third.
Yeah, it's much more kind of companionable. And remember that I said there's this sharp contrast, that the God of Genesis chapter 1 is that God, if you had to pick one word. Great. Great. That God is great. And the God in the second and third chapter of Genesis is
Good.
Yeah. And the genius of Genesis to hold those two assertions together in tension with each other. It's hard to do, really hard to do. We moved on and we looked at the rest of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And so what are the big stories after the creation? The first, how do we get humanity out of the Garden of Eden?
The fall.
The fall, exactly. And then what's the next big story that happens? Cain and Abel, right? Fratricide, right? And then the third story,
Noah
and the flood. And then the fourth story,
Tower of Babel.
Exactly. Those first three stories establish a pattern that we come to sort of expect. Do you remember what that pattern was?
People sin, God punishes but shows mercy.
Exactly. In every one of those stories, humanity's the one that messes things up. God has set forth, prescribed, and perhaps in some ways carries out a sentence of judgment for what they've done. But then the final word is God backs away from it. So that there is this note of grace that tempers what happens. I mean, things could have been really bad if God had just done what God felt like doing at the flood, right? God repented in his heart that he had ever made man, right? I'm going to blot everything out. Well, oh well, game over, right? But God, in God's grace, preserves Noah and those with him in the ark. The story is able to move forward because of God's grace. The last story in that primeval history was the Tower of Babel. And what's the sin? Hubris. 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 I love that word. What's the judgment?
Be scattered.
Scattering.
Scattered
And-
Different
And their
language.
language confounded.
the confounding of the languages, or the confusing of the languages. What's missing that we've come to expect? Mercy. Mercy.
God takes a step back, but he
Exactly.
doesn't this
He
time.
doesn't this time. And so the attentive reader is left hanging. What? Wait a minute. We need a solution here. Humanity is completely disconnected from itself and from the earth. And that's when we reach the 12th chapter of Genesis. And God changes gears here. To whom do we turn in the 12th chapter of Genesis? What happens in the very first verse?
The Lord sends him, sends Abram to another country, to a land
Yes.
he promises.
Yes, the Lord Yahweh, right? Remember, it's that
Yahweh.
capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Yahweh said to Abraham, go. All of a sudden, God is taking an action plan with just one person and one people. There's been a genealogy before this, and it's the first of many, and everybody falls asleep when they read them. But the reason it's there is to remind us that we are moving from this global perspective. Cain and Abel, the flood, Tower of Babel. This is everybody on the planet is involved in these stories. And now there's this genealogy. Well, there are people over here, and there are people here, and there are people here. And we're going to talk about the people just over here. So all of a sudden, God has chosen a people. And he's made a covenant. And this covenant, it's the second covenant in the Bible. The first one is between God and
Adam and Eve.
Eve.
close. No, it's between God and the earth in the flood story, right? I will never
I'll do it again.
I'll never do this again, and I will put my bow in the cloud as a sign of my covenant with the earth. So the second covenant in the Bible here in chapter 12, God said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you I will curse, and by you all the families of the earth shall be blessed, or bless themselves, depending on your translation. This is a covenant. Now, did anybody look up what covenant means? An agreement. An
I
agreement.
did.
Yes. What, Kathy? What? So we've got agreement.
Yes. A covenant is an agreement. The verb is agree by lease, deed, or other legal contract. And the
Contract. Contract. That's a critical word. Anything else? Is there another word that you know that means?
well, they also gave a biblical meaning.
Yes.
A contract covenant, literally a contract. In the Bible, an agreement between God and his people in which God makes promises to his people and usually requires certain conduct from them.
Very good. There's one other word, and you know it. You just don't associate it with covenant.
Promise.
Deed,
No.
Testament.
Testament, yes. Testament means covenant. A testament, a testimony, a witness, a witnessing to something that is going to be done. Covenants were very common in the ancient Near East. And the covenants that we see between God and Abraham take the form, big fancy word, of a suzerainty covenant. Suzerei, suzerainty covenant. If we were to transplant this into the Middle Ages in Europe, it would be the kind of deal there is between a lord and a vassal. So there's definitely hierarchy
no,
in the relationship.
suzerain.
Do me if, yeah, just, yeah, thanks.
Everybody.
Yeah. There's a hierarchy here. There's somebody in charge and there's somebody lower ranking. And the initiative for the covenant and the ultimate authority for the covenant, of course, resides with the higher ranking individual. So a king and his vassal. And yes, Kathy, you're right. In a biblical context, it's usually an agreement between God and his people or a person, and often involves requirements by the lower ranking person, by the people. But there is also this expectation that the higher ranking individual is supposed to do his part as well, right? Let's think again about the Middle Ages. I think that can kind of ground this in something we can understand. So King Arthur had his knights at his round table, and all of his knights knew that if King Arthur was involved in a fight with France, that they were expected to come and help. But simultaneously, those knights knew that if something happened in their territory, somebody came after them, King Arthur, with his troops, was supposed to call his troops and his other knights to come and help that knight who was himself being attacked. So it's a two-way street. There can also be covenants between peers, right? And that'd be like now, somebody selling their home. I'm going to give you the keys to the house and you're going to give me a certain amount of earnest money, down payment, and then monthly payment in a mortgage. That's a covenant. So there are expectations on both sides. What is unique about this kind of covenant is there really any way to hold God to his end of the deal? No. It is entirely dependent on God simply choosing to honor the deal. And that's what scripture talks about, means when it talks about God is righteous. God is just. God honors God's covenants, not because God has to, but because it is in the character of God to honor God's promises. Make sense? So let's look at this particular covenant that now focuses no longer on all of humanity, but on this now chosen people. What all is Abram called to leave?
Country, your family, your father's home.
Yeah.
Your kindred,
Yep.
everything.
Everything. And if you looked in your study guide, what kind of place had Ur been and Haran, where Abraham is called from? Was it Podunk?
Kind of metropolitan.
Very metropolitan. Exactly. It was very much so a New York or a Paris of that region. And where exactly is he called to go?
He doesn't really know.
He doesn't know. Yeah, he doesn't know at all. Right, that's exactly, Kathy. What does God say? To a place that I will
Show you.
show you. There's no map, there's no GPS, there's no instructions. It's just start going. And eventually I'll tell you that you've gotten there. Wow. Wow. Okay. Now, what is it that God promises God will do? Big picture. I will make of you
A blessing.
and a blessing, and before that, a
Great nation. Great
great
nation.
nation. Yeah. Now let's turn over to chapter 17, verse 17. What is the first and most obvious obstacle? Somebody read that to us. Genesis 17, verse 17.
But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and
Oh.
his household.
Try 17.
12:17.
No,
17.
so-
chapter 17, verse 17.
Get this.
That's okay.
Somebody else go.
That's okay.
When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless.
Whoops, 17, 17.
Okay, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?
Yeah. We have a little problem. We all have problems. Yeah. How are we going to make a great nation out of two people who have no children and are, let us say, well beyond childbearing years? This just seems impossible. Notice that God seems to choose to do things in such a way that common sense would say it's impossible. God seems to choose things so that when they're accomplished, there's no alternative but to say, God did this. There's no other way.
We probably get it there like mid after.
Backing up a little bit, I got ahead of myself. Have we gotten any explanation up until this point as to why God has chosen Abraham? Is
I
this
don't
like in
think
the
so.
flood where in Noah it said Noah was blameless, so he gets picked because he's blameless? Kathy, I heard you say, what did you say?
I don't believe to this point that we know why he was chosen.
You are absolutely correct. No reason is given. And that is a foundational fact for both Judaism and Christianity. That this is an example of grace. And I'm going to use the old Presbyterian definition of grace, the unmerited favor of God. We are not told any reason, and we have no reason to believe there is a reason that God chooses Abraham, except that God chooses Abraham. Sidebar.
That's always supposed to understand why, right? Just that he
He did it.
did it.
Did it. He did it. And as we get to, if you get to know Abraham, you wonder more and more. He's not a great paragon of virtue. This is an important sidebar. As I said, it is foundational in both Judaism and Christianity that no reason is given for why Abraham is chosen. Those of you who are old enough to remember when Bill Moyer did a series on Genesis, if you have not seen it, I recommend it in the highest possible terms. Just gets really good scholars sitting around a living room talking about the great stories. Jewish, Christian, liberal, conservative, and in a couple of cases includes a Muslim scholar. the Quran has this story, right? Uh, but in the Quran, there is a critical difference. And the scholar actually who was participating in this conversation pushed in to the conversation about grace and said, now, wait a minute, I need to say something here. The Quran says that God reached out to Abraham because Abraham reached out to God first. That Abraham, living in this polytheistic society, had rejected that idea in favor of the idea of one God.
Would
And
you, I'm sorry, I could not hear. You
Sure.
said God reached out to Abraham because,
in the Quran,
Mhm.
it teaches that God reached out to Abram because Abram first reached out to God.
Oh,
That in
thank
this
you.
polytheistic society, Abram rejected the idea of multiple gods in favor of the idea of one sovereign God. So there is a foundational difference in the theology, and there is a foundational difference in, okay, big fancy word, soteriology. Soter is from the Greek meaning to save, ology, a word about. So how are people saved? In Judaism and in Christianity, by the grace of God. In Islam, by reaching out to Allah. So the starting point is very different. And I point that out because A, I think it is an important difference. And B, it was important to that Muslim scholar that that point be made. That difference. So I want to respect her in that regard.
What did you say the name of that show was? Bill Moyers?
Bill Moyers, Moyer''S,
Yeah.
and it was simply called Genesis.
Okay.
It was run on PBS. Good luck finding it. Maybe they've got it on YouTube now. It never made it to DVD, sadly. The VHS you can find, maybe, but you will pay through the nose for it. But you might be able to find it on YouTube. It is outstanding.
Mary Elizabeth?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, Joanna.
Another thing I really love about this story is that, so Abram has a land. He's asked to leave a land, right?
Yeah.
And he becomes a wanderer
Yes.
for a long time.
Yes.
And it's almost like God says, that is not my land. That is not my people.
Yeah.
I'm a God of the wanderer, and we're going to eventually go to the land that's going to be yours. There's just something about that. Maybe I've romanticized it, but I love the idea that God says, no, I want you to be a wanderer. I want you to be divested of this.
Absolutely. And you're playing into what is an overarching theme throughout scripture is this idea of being called out. And it's called out as compared to thrown out, right? We were thrown out of Eden, but we're called out of Ur of the Chaldees. We're going to be called out of Egypt. And sadly, we are often going to want to go back to Egypt. Certainly Paul spends a lot of time using that metaphor that we are a called out community, we're called to be in the world, though not of the world, to be different, and that we on earth have no continuing place. I've been watching again, I recommended to you the TNT miniseries starring Richard Harris called Abraham. So I've been rewatching it, and I had forgotten how slowly the plot moves once Abram and his entourage leave Haran, and they go through the desert, and they almost die in the desert, and they take a lot of liberties with the story, but it moves so very slow. And so much of I think that's deliberate, because poor Abram all this while is still waiting for a child to be born. And that experience of wandering and waiting and homelessness and not feeling settled anywhere. I mean, that's very much so the human experience, right? Not
Yeah.
feeling settled.
Yeah, you know, Canaan almost becomes a myth.
Mhm.
Like when they get there, they say, "Oh, they're giants." You know, like
Yeah.
they don't have any concept of reality anymore
Yeah,
because it's become super real to them
Yeah.
in a lot of ways.
yeah, yeah. Very, very good observation. Thank you for that. In chapter 17, verse 18, Abraham continues his argument with God. And what does he say in Genesis chapter 17, verse 18?
And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing.
Yes, yes. Who's Ishmael?
It is Abraham's son by Hagar, who
Right.
is Sarah's maid servant.
Right, slave, call it what she was, right?
Yeah, slave.
Right, so Abraham's concubine. Although she's still owned by Sarah. Why do you think God is insistent? No, isn't that fascinating? Verse 19, God said, no. No. But Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. Why do you think God is so insistent that Sarah be the mother?
It's his plan. It's his way.
Yeah.
It's not man's meddling that creates this thing.
Yeah, or woman's either, right?
Yeah.
And
Right?
also Sarah was Abram's legal wife, whereas Hagar was only the servant.
Yes. Feminists could make a strong argument here.
Mhm.
God is insisting that Sarah's status will not be diminished simply because she hasn't had the firstborn child. The covenant's going to go through her. And of course, which is more, let's just say, explainable? Abraham having a child by Hagar or Abraham having a child by Sarah?
By Sarah.
Explainable.
Hagar.
Explainable.
By
Right,
Hagar.
Hagar, right? She's young,
Yeah.
she's fertile, right?
She's a slave. She can't say no.
Right. But Sarah having a child.
That's supposed to be impossible.
Right. God insists on doing things God's way so that it's really clear that God did it.
Maybe it's also that word covenant that you've just explained to
Yes.
us. Like
Yes,
this was the terms of the covenant,
absolutely.
right?
Yep, absolutely.
If you're a Muslim though, do you interpret this as God saying no because he knew that Ishmael would be
God doesn't say no in the Quran.
that's what,
In the Quran, the promise goes through Ishmael.
right.
Yeah. And it's very important to them that they are the children of the slave woman. Islam means to submit. Muslim means one who submits in Arabic. So it's very important to them in their self-identity. They are the children of the woman who had to submit. So it's a very different concept. We are descended from the man who wrestled with God in the wilderness, Jacob. It's a very different concept of the relationship. Yeah, I think all of those are valid reasons why God says no. No, it's going to be through Sarah. And just food for thought. What has been the historic impact of Abram and Sarai trying to fulfill the covenant their own way?
Hasn't worked very well.
No,
Up to today. It's not
no, we
working at all.
really, yeah. Yeah. little decisions, taking matters in our own hands can really have traumatic consequences for everyone involved. God appears again to Abram and Sarai in chapter 18. And let's read that passage. It's such an amazing passage. Somebody read for us Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 8, and then somebody pick up at 9 through 15.
I've got the first part. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed, and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent of Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 shayes of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf, gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said.
We'll take the rest through 15.
Oh, sorry, did I overdo? I didn't mean to.
That's okay.
Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." But Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did."
Thank you, Dee. It's a marvelous passage. Simply thinking about life in the ancient Near East, what do we learn about ancient Near Eastern hospitality here?
It's a value.
Highly valued, highly valued. To send somebody away, to deny someone hospitality, was essentially a death sentence. Because where were they going to get water? Where were they going to get food? Right? So, and notice that nobody says to Abram, "Hi, this is the Lord here." Doesn't have an introduction card. Just the Lord appeared. And there are 3 men standing there. Make of that what you will. Somehow, Abraham, for whatever reason, maybe it's just good hospitality, invites them to stay. What does he offer them first? Water, right? They've been going through the desert, water. Then what does he have Sarah do?
Make cakes or bread.
Right. Get our best ingredients and bake bread. This was a woman's job. Traditionally, women made the bread. What does Abram do?
He selects the calf to be prepared.
Yes. Yes. So slaughtering the animal and preparing the meat was a man's job, right? That persists to today. Who's in charge of the grill? Dad's in charge of the grill, right? Right. Men and fire. Ha. Add meat. Ha. Right. So he has the grill going. And notice too, I think this is fascinating. Along with the milk and the bread, what does he take?
Curds
and milk. Is that combination, bread, meat, curds, and milk, is that kosher? No, no,
Dairy has to be separate.
right, no dairy with meat. This was fascinating to me. This is not a kosher meal. So and notice that, what does he do? Does he sit down and eat with them?
But these are before,
No.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
so it's okay, right?
It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It also maybe doesn't matter, right? Does he sit down and eat with them?
No.
No.
Oh,
He stands by while they eat. Again, typical ancient Near Eastern hospitality, and you'll even see it today. Uh, Notice something. Paul alludes, or the author of Hebrews, we usually call it Paul, even though the book doesn't say it's by Paul, alludes to this passage. Look over in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2. Oh,
yep,
Yeah,
it's
yep.
2.
yeah, 2. Somebody read that for us, 13:2.
Do not
Do
forget.
not, go
Do not-
ahead.
Okay. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it.
Yeah. Paul, or the author of Hebrews, may be alluding to this passage. There's also Greek myth of gods coming to towns and people either being hospitable to them or not being hospitable to them. But it's entirely possible that the author of Hebrews is referring to this passage here. Interestingly, suggesting that Abram did not really know who these people were until they started saying stuff to him. Let me ask you. We could hear Abram called by Paul, called our father in the faith. Let's starting thinking about what that means. Let's look in Hebrews, because we've got an extended reflection on Abraham in Hebrews. Look at Hebrews chapter 11. This is often called the roll call of faith. We're not going to read everything about Abraham, but it begins chapter 11 of Hebrews, verse 1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. Somebody read for us verses 8 through
By
12.
By
8 through 12.
faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him and with the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore.
Thank you. So what does this passage say was their faith?
Obedience.
Yeah, that Abram went when he was supposed to go. If he does, we're glad to give it.
I apologize. I'm quite all right. I'm quite all right. I'm quite all right. Thank you so much for calling. I am fine. So sorry.
It's all right. It's all right. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about
How
it.
many times have we called somebody that we
Oh
didn't
my
mean to?
gosh. I'm glad they're checking on you.
Yeah.
Whoops,
Sure they have false alarms.
so sorry.
Don't apologize.
I don't know, are they? You might want to ask for a reduction on the rate.
Please forgive me.
They should be asking you for forgiveness.
I'm so
So
sorry.
don't apologize.
No problem.
Yeah, yeah. So they obeyed. In what way did they obey?
They left their home.
Yeah, yeah. And it says they believed that this would happen, that it would be fulfilled. Look at 12:1. What's the analogy that Paul uses? Abraham goes on a journey. What does Paul say lies before us? Somebody read 12:1.
Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us.
Thank you. So Abram had a journey. We have a race. And we are to do what so that we can run successfully?
Run with perseverance.
Yeah, just like Grant Fisher did, right? In the 10,000 meter.
Yeah.
Run with perseverance. And how do we carry a big backpack with us?
No, we lay aside every
Yeah.
weight.
Right. Just like what was Abram called to do?
Get up and go.
Get up and go and
Leave
leave everything.
behind.
Yep. Leave everything else behind. This complete reliance on God, leaning into that grace is really the example that the author of Hebrews wants us to draw from our reading about Abram and Sarai. Now, do you think that Sarah and Abraham are really good models of faith?
Yes and no.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. What do you mean?
Well, I think Abraham gave his wife away twice
Yeah.
to two other people.
Yeah.
And claimed she was his sister.
Yeah.
You don't give your wife away. I mean, unless she's
Yeah.
really a piece of work,
Right.
then you might consider
Right.
it. But also,
Even limiting ourselves to what we've read tonight. What would you say?
Still yes and no, because Sarah didn't have enough faith to believe that God was going to give her a child.
Yeah.
So she gave Hagar to
Yeah.
Abraham.
And what did she do in the tent?
Laugh.
She laughed. And then
That's the
she
idea.
lied about it. Right.
And
Right.
Abraham, he didn't say, no, let's wait,
Yeah.
right? No.
Yeah,
let's
he was
wait.
like,
Right.
okay.
Right. Right. Where have we heard that before? Right.
Uh-huh.
Garden of Eden, right?
Yeah.
Right. And did he just have a little chortle, a little giggle?
no, he
Over
was rolled down on the floor.
Exactly. He fell on his face laughing. This is hilarious. What are you thinking, Lord? Yeah.
You know,
So-
though it hits me as a very realistic
It's-
picture of
Exactly.
humans trying to have faith.
Exactly.
Right. Faith is hard.
Yeah. And it is, remember Hebrews 11, it's the assurance of things hoped for, things not seen. And sometimes that's pretty hilarious. And how do you react if Abraham and Sarah both were these paragons of virtue? Absolutely. I believe that you're going to make me, this 100-year-old man, and my 90-year-old wife have a baby by next year. Never mind that we've been trying for the last 83. I believe. I'm gonna get up in the morning and I'm gonna sing a hymn, right? Would that be as helpful to you as somebody that fell on his face laughing?
Probably not.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever fell on your face laughing? Or just gone, yeah, right, Lord?
Yeah, exactly. When that puppy started following me home. So I had this puppy I was not intending to have. And now I have a 7-month-old out of control puppy who's 50 pounds now. And I'm like, okay, it's just a puppy. I get that. But I was not planning to have him. But I had to train him. So yes, he has a sense of humor.
Yes, absolutely. The Lord has a
Yeah.
sense of humor.
And we share it sometimes. 'Cause
Yeah.
we laugh.
Yeah, yeah. What other thoughts do you have about Abram and Sarah as models of faith?
Could you explain the significance of the name change?
Sure. A lot of ink has been spilled on a lot of paper. The names Sarah and Sarai both mean princess. Some scholars think that the name change from Sarai to Sarah has to do with being simply the princess of one people to being the princess of all peoples. Abram to Abraham is a mighty father to a father of many. Is that the intention? We're not told. But naming someone was an exercise of power over them, right? Your parents name you, you don't name yourself, right? It's also, well, so in that regard, Yahweh is exercising power and authority over these people. I'm going to define who you are. It's also a definitive change in that person. Think about Saul. You're not going to be Saul anymore. You are Paul. That it's almost as if this is now a new person because this person now belongs to God. So great question. Rabbis and Christian scholars have tried to decipher it. We really don't know. We really don't know. Any other questions, thoughts at this point?
Yeah, I was taken by two passages in all of this that struck me kind of funny. It's my warped sense of humor. First of all, in Genesis 12, and he talks about calling Sarah his sister
Yes,
because she was so beautiful. She was about 65 years old at the time.
right, right.
I don't know a woman alive that would be so beautiful that the Pharaoh would have to kill her husband in order to have her. Yeah.
Yes, and you are not the first person to point that out and find that humorous. Although some people suggest maybe Pharaoh's vision wasn't that good, or maybe the pickings in Egypt were slim. We don't know. But yeah, it's one of the mysteries here. It's also perhaps part of what should I say? Part of the magical quality of Sarah, that she is this very senior woman and yet is still, what should I say? She could get cast on the TV show Sex and the City, believably. You know,
The Elizabeth Taylor of her age.
there you go. There you go. Yeah.
The other thing that struck me was when Abram had to line and go and get circumcised,
Yeah.
and then he told all of his family they're going to have to line up too. Can you imagine the looks on their faces when they're told they're going to have to go get circumcised?
It probably did not go over very well. It's not a it's not a unique custom in the ancient Near East, but it is an unusual custom. To this day, Muslim boys, they're circumcised at the age of 13. Hebrew babies, of course, are circumcised on the 8th day. or a man at the time of his conversion. Paul is really going to lean into this, right? That has Abraham been circumcised when God enters into the covenant with him?
No.
No.
Not yet.
No, he has not been, and there's no mention of it at that point. Paul uses that very heavily as part of his argument for salvation by grace and not by merit. It's not because Abraham jumped through these ethnic identity hoops that God chooses him. God chose him when he was still a Gentile. And that is why Abraham is not just the father of the Jewish people, but of Christians as well, because he became a follower of Yahweh while he was still a Gentile. Questions, other questions, comments?
I just wanted to say I appreciated you spending a little time on covenant. When I was reading through the book, and they said they could have called the Old and the New Testament the Old and the New Covenant, and I really didn't get that, but your explanation helped, so thanks.
Right.
That's good. I'd never
Good.
even considered that.
Good. And it's another reason why I don't like the names Old and New Testament, because it makes it sound as though somehow that old covenant is no longer in force. We better hope that God continues to honor God's covenant with Abraham, because that's us. Notice, and this is really where I want us to focus some attention. Let's go back to that chapter 12 in Genesis. Let's reread that covenant, chapter 12, verses 1 through 5, with an eye to figuring out, where do we fit into this story here? Somebody read for us again, chapter 12, verses 1 through 3.
Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you all, the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Thank you. Where do we come into this story? Where are we?
Right there at the end.
Yeah, exactly. All the families of the earth shall be blessed.
That's really an earth-shattering concept.
Yes, it
The way
is.
society is thought of back then.
Run with that.
Well, I mean, people are identified with land, and the idea that there could be families over the whole earth that would be somehow kin and blessed through this God. I mean, it
Yeah.
changes the cosmos, right?
Yes.
Totally.
Yes. Yes, very much so. Gods were tied to a place in the ancient Near Eastern mind. You might remember reading about Baal Peor. Baal Peor, so the god Baal of Peor, the god in this place. And then there might be a Baal Haran. There's the god of that place. There's the god of the mountain. There's the god of the valley. There's the god of the river. There's the god of this. They were tied to a place. And yet this God is asserting that this God has the ability to bless everybody everywhere without regard to where they are. I want you to contrast chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 with chapter 11, verse 4. What is it that the people are trying to do? Somebody read for us 11:4.
Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth.
What are they trying to do?
They want
To
to
be like God.
Make a name for themselves. What does God say God is going to do for Abraham in chapter 12, verse 2? I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make
Your name great.
Your name great. The people tried to do something that God was going to do. And they're trying to build this tower so that what won't happen?
So they won't be scattered over the face of the earth.
Because if we get scattered, what do we think will happen?
We won't have a name.
You won't have a name, you'll be diluted, you'll be nobody. What is God's plan? Make a great nation, make families all over the earth that will all be blessed through Abraham and Abraham's descendants. What was God's first commandment?
I mean, like a.
Very first. Very
the
first.
God before me.
Be fruitful and multiply. God's vision is to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and more people get brought in by spreading out. In the Tower of Babel, they're trying to do this. Just us. Just us. In our tower, and we're going to be great. It's not God's plan. God's plan flies in the face of what we've seen happening, and that is human destructiveness getting worse and worse and worse. God's plan is that grace will outstrip that, outrace that. God is being great, and God is being good. It is blistering hot in here. So, unless there are other questions, I don't want people to melt. We can call it an early night. Other questions or comments?
This is great.
Thank you for a
glad.
beautiful list.
No, thank y'all.
And thank you for recording it.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Thank Brooks for being our
Thanks, Brooke.
IT
you,
jockeys.
Here to help.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And next week, you got your handout. Assignment for next week is to read the Exodus story and there's a passage to pay closest attention and use your study guide. So God's created, God's called. Now God's got to do some more work. So good job, y'all.
Have a good week.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank y'all.
Bye.